chapter has like the following questions. So it's just, what is an emotion? What is the relationship between emotions and truth? What is the relationship between emotions and morality? Like those are the big kind of questions. So I'll just start with the first one here. So I follow a lot of contemporary philosophers, and I take an emotion to be a mental state that involves an evaluation of a situation and that has an affect that is either positive or negative. And so what this means is that an emotion has a cognitive and an affective component to it. And so the cognitive component is what the emotion is about. So when you're having an emotion, you're mentally representing the world as being a certain way. So for example, anybody watching this video, they're probably mentally representing this video as like, having particular properties, like being very exciting. At least I'm hoping so. I mean, I don't know. And then the affective component is that there's something that it feels like to have that mental representation, which is they're going to feel really excited. And so that's the affect of the emotion. So the cognitive aspect of the emotion, though, like that's what distinguishes emotions from other affective states, like just like pure bodily sensations. So like unlike various bodily sensations, like your emotions are always about something. They always have like an object that they aim to evaluate or represent. And then there's this further aspect of emotions that's like actually really important for the debate over God's emotional life. So your emotions are always grounded in a particular cognitive basis that you have. And so the cognitive basis is what philosophers of emotion call your cares or concerns. So just like, what do you actually care about? And what you care about, it creates a disposition in you to have certain kinds of emotional responses to the world. So what you care about is what you take to be worthy of your attention and worthy of your action. And so these are cares and concerns that they create these emotional dispositions towards certain situations. So because of this, like when you have an emotion, you're evaluating something that you think is worthy of your attention and that you think is worthy of acting on behalf of. And so this is why a person's emotions, like they really help you understand like a person's reasons for acting the way that they do. Now, sometimes these dispositions in philosophy of emotions, they're called sentiments. And then other times they're talked about in terms of a person's like moral character traits, like being cruel or kind. So for example, like love and hate, these are like really classic examples of sentiments towards like a person or a thing or an institution. So if you're disposed to love a particular person, like you're going to be disposed to have a whole range of emotional reactions to that person, just kind of dependent upon their situation. Right. So since your emotions, they evolve like a mental representation and these evaluations of situations. So because of that, your emotions can be true or false, depending on how well your emotion like tracks a given situation. So sometimes people like they get annoyed when I say that sort of thing. When I say your emotions can be true or false, but you notice like they're getting annoyed at that. Like they're annoyed and they're making and being annoyed, like they're making an evaluation of like a particular philosophical claim that they think is just deeply mistaken. And then also, usually these are the same kind of people who tell me I should be outraged by what I'm seeing in the news right now. And so they think that they can tell me what kind of emotional reaction I should be having. And I'm like, well, that seems kind of curious. And what I noticed, though, is like actually we're constantly telling people that we think that we can tell them what kind of emotion they should be having or not having. So here's some different examples. So you've probably heard statements like, you're overreacting to the situation. Things are not that bad. Or you might have heard other things too, where you might say to somebody, you have every right to be angry because what you're experiencing is wrong. And so in the first example, like the speaker is judging that a person's emotions are inaccurate, whereas in the second example, like they're judging the person's emotions are accurate. So what it seems like is that your emotions can be accurate or inaccurate depending on how well they track the values in reality. And kind of closely connected to this, your emotions can also be justified or unjustified. So your emotions are justified if you have like good reasons to have the felt evaluation that you're having. So for example, say you're watching like a really sad movie. Well, if the story is actually like really sad, then you're going to be justified in feeling sad because anybody who's watching that sad movie is going to feel sad. Whereas maybe consider like a different situation where something bad has happened to you. So you have like you've got the emotion of anger, but say that whatever you experienced was just like a really like minor offense. So you're correct in being angry, but like you're demanding blood in response to like a really minor offense. You might think, well, gosh, you're overreacting, right? So like you got the right emotion, but the amount of the emotion that you have is just unjustified because you shouldn't be demanding blood in response to like a minor offense. Mm-hmm. So there's several different ways, but I'll just mention a few that I discuss in the book. So first, emotions, they can reveal what a person subjectively cares about. So if you find like a friend crying over the death of their grandmother, like you're going to conclude that this person, like she really cares deeply for her grandmother. Second, emotions, they can be revelatory of objective value. And so this is because emotions involve an experiential acquaintance with the value of an object. So for example, theists are often going to say you should just come and experience the goodness of God. And so the idea is that like having some kind of experience of God, like you will become acquainted with the goodness of God. And then others are going to point out that it's only through emotions that you're able to experience and identify objective values in the world. So some philosophers like Tasia Scruton is going to say, if you don't have emotions, then you're not going to be able to really be in contact with the moral landscape. Third, emotions can help motivate your moral reasoning. So emotions are evaluations of what you take to be worthy of your attention. And so emotions, they can really like lock your focus in on different moral premises that you're trying to deliberate about because you care so much about them. You want to get it right. So you're really focused in on them. And then fourth, emotions, they motivate your moral actions because emotions are evaluations of what you take to be worthy of acting on behalf of. And so a person acts on behalf of something precisely because she judges it to have like a certain value or disvalue. So that's some of the ways that I talk about in the book for the relationship between emotions and morality. Now, so what I do in the book, though, I try to tease out like the classical theistic claims that timelessness, immutability, and simplicity, that they're like systematically connected to impassibility. I've got a separate paper called "Why Can't the Impassible God Suffer," which is going to be linked to in the descriptions.
Yeah.
And so in that paper, I argue that they're not actually systematically connected. But for the book, though, I just try to just assume that they are. But I think what's really going on is a lot of classical theists, I think they're often sneaking in the doctrine of divine simplicity into their arguments in some sort of question-begging way. But like I said, I just kind of set some of those issues aside for the book. So the main thing to focus on in this video is like what exactly is impassibility and which emotions an impassible God can have. So impassibility means that it is impossible for God to suffer. It is impossible for God to be moved, caused, or influenced by anything external to God. And impassibility also means that God can't have passions. But this is actually really difficult to figure out because there's a lot of disagreement in the classical tradition over what counts as a passion. And so, like I said, this is where things get really complicated because our modern English word of emotion, like that covers like a whole range of different affective states that, you know, the classical tradition would sometimes consider some of those things to be passions, but not all those things. And then you can even find some more recent theologians, like in the 1800s, say that, you know, God has no passions, but God does have emotions. And so things get really weird when you're trying to like understand this classical story of God's emotional life. So in order to like try to make things a lot easier, I identify 3 different criteria that classical theists have used to discern which emotions God can have. And so the first says that God can have any emotion that is consistent with perfect rationality. And then the second criteria says that God can have any emotion that is consistent with God's perfect moral goodness. But those 2 criteria, they're not terribly interesting because a passibilist is also going to affirm those criteria. Mm-hmm. So this doesn't really help you fully understand impassibility. So what really takes you all the way to impassibility is the classical theistic like understanding of God's like divine happiness. And so the classical theist says that God is in a state of pure, undisturbed bliss that is based entirely on himself. And so the third and final criteria is that God cannot have any emotion that conflicts with his perfect happiness. Yeah, so I think this is a really powerful argument, and it actually looks really similar to something that Nicholas Wolterstorff has offered in the past. Mm-hmm. So Wolterstorff, what he does is he focuses on Aquinas' claim that I mentioned earlier about like a virtuous person ought to be upset by witnessing a really tragic event. And so Wolterstorff is like, well, look, if you're going to accept those claims about like virtuous people, then you ought to accept those claims about like a morally perfect God. And I touch a bit on this, but I don't really get too much into this in the book because I found the responses to this argument like really unimpressive. So basically what I found was classical theists responded to Wolterstorff with this sort of like kind of straw man question. And it goes something like this. So they say like, well, which would you prefer? a passible God who suffers with you, or an impassible God who cannot save you? Or I'm sorry, no, that's not right. Which would you prefer, a passible God who suffers with you, or an impassible God who can save you from your suffering? So a passible God supposedly can't save you at all, whereas an impassible God can save you. And I find it really difficult to figure out what exactly the force is behind a question like that, because it seems like it's assuming really odd things about passibility. And these replies actually are pretty explicit about this. They'll say that a passible God cannot save you from your suffering, because if God suffers, then God would need someone to save him from his suffering. And I just find that a straw man, because the passibilist still thinks God's omnipotent. So why can't an omnipotent God save himself from suffering that he freely entered into? Mm-hmm. So I just decide I'm just going to, set that aside for the book. But notice though something about these kind of responses though. They don't actually address this Wolterstorff style argument that we're discussing here. Like, it actually just pivots the conversation. And I notice this a lot in the literature, which is like another reason why I just don't include it in my book, because people are constantly pivoting to different discussions. And I'm like, can we please stay on topic for a second here? So I do know there's this one other way though that you could possibly respond to an objection like this. So a classical theist like Brian Davies, it could say, well, look, God's just not a moral agent. And so then you would get out of these kind of worries. But a lot of classical theists are unwilling to make that move because it's pretty extreme. And and a lot of classical theists, and then myself included, are also going to say, I don't really quite understand how you can square that with the claim that God is the greatest good and the source of morality. So these are things, like I said, I don't really go into in the book because I just wasn't really satisfied with a lot of the discussion on these things. So neoclassical theism that I develop in the book, it says that God is temporal, mutable, unified, and passible. And in the book, I try to draw out some of the systematic connections between these attributes in a way that I've not done in any other writings. So neoclassical theism, it's not open theism because it affirms that God knows the future. And it's also not panentheism or pantheism because it affirms a kind of distinction between a creator and a creature. And then also neoclassical theism is not process theology because it's not affirming a process metaphysics. So for this video, though, we're just, I'll just focus, I guess, just on passibility. So divine passibility affirms that God can be moved and influenced by things that are external to the divine nature. So God can suffer with us, and God can have a very wide range of emotions that are consistent with perfect rationality and perfect moral goodness. However, there's a little bit more to the story, though. So philosophers and theologians who affirm passibility, they also affirm that God has empathy. And this is really important because, as we mentioned earlier, impassibility in the classical tradition, they explicitly deny that God has empathy. So I spend quite a bit of time in this chapter trying to discuss empathy and then a version of passibility that affirms something called omnisubjectivity. And omnisubjectivity is said to be God's perfect capacity to engage in total empathy with all phenomenal conscious states of all creatures. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when you empathize with someone, you're coming to know what it is like for that person to feel a particular way. Mm-hmm. So if we can use Joe and I as an example. So Ryan empathizes with Joe if Joe knows that Joe is having a particular emotion. Ryan knows what it is like to have that emotion. And then something about Joe grounds Ryan's knowledge of what it is like for Joe to feel this particular way, to have this particular emotion. So when I empathize with Joe, it's important to note that I'm coming to understand what it is like for Joe to feel this particular way. So when I'm consciously aware that I'm trying on a copy of Joe's emotions. So I don't take this to be my own emotion, because the whole point of me empathizing is to try to understand what it's like for Joe to feel a particular way. So if I successfully empathize with Joe, I do feel what Joe feels, but that doesn't mean that my own emotional evaluation of the situation is going to necessarily agree with Joe's. Mm. And this is something Linda Zagzebski points out, and a lot of others do too. They'll say that empathy is actually an incredibly important step in coming to form sound moral judgments on other people. So when you come to empathize with someone else, you come to understand what they are feeling and what they're thinking and why they acted the way that they did. But when you come to have that kind of empathetic understanding, you're also in a really prime position to make your own emotional evaluation of the situation. And so at that point, you're in a position to agree or disagree with the person. And so when it comes to omnisubjectivity, The claim is that God has total perfect empathy with all of these different creaturely conscious states. And then according to Linda Zagzebski, she says that means that God is able to be the perfect moral judge. So one of the things I pointed out at the beginning of the video is that the love of God has been like really a main point of contention in these debates over impassibility. So lots of theologians and philosophers in the 20th and 21st century, they claim that an impassible God cannot be loving. So, for example, my friend Tom Ord, he's offered like several different biblical and philosophical arguments for thinking that love involves empathetic response to others. And if that's correct, I mean, divine impassibility is in direct conflict with love because an impassible God cannot have empathy. So Ord's definition of love just rules impassibility out from the start. And then someone like Tasia Scrutton, what she does, she points out that these arguments surrounding love, they've just reached a stalemate because each side's going to favor their own conception of divine love. And so again, like, you know, if you've got someone like Ord, he puts his view on the table, it's got empathy built into it. The classical theist is just going to go, well, I just reject that understanding of love. So this the dialectic here, this debate over love, it just really stalled out. And so in light of this, what I try to do is I try to get the debate up and running again by just saying, you know, classical theist, I'm going to grant you your own understanding of love. And then let's see if, you know, your own understanding of love is actually consistent with impassibility. That's the idea. I do two different things in the book. So first thing is I discuss this idea of how uninfluenced God's love is. Because on impassibility, God's love is completely and utterly uninfluenced by anything external to God. So nothing about you, who you are, nothing about your very existence could influence God's love. And in fact, all of God's love is really self-love on classical theism. And then next what I do is I kind of point out a lot of different thinkers throughout Christian history. They say that love involves two different desires. So first, there's this desire for the good of the beloved or the good for the person you love. So like you just, you know, you want what's best for them. And then second, there's this desire for unity with your loved one. So you want to have some kind of mutual closeness or unity with someone that you love. And in a recent paper defending impassibility, Eric Silverman complains that critics only attack the first desire, and he says they just completely ignore the second desire. And Silverman thinks that the second desire of love really helps impassibility out quite a bit in light of all these criticisms. So I decide, okay, you know, fine, I'll just focus this debate on just the desire for unity and see, does that actually, you know, really work with impassibility? So what I do in the book then is I consider Eleanor Stump's recent treatment of these two desires of love, because it's one of the most thorough Thomistic articulations of desires of love in these recent debates in philosophy of religion. So I spend quite a bit of time examining her view. But just, you know, here's some of the highlights. So in order to have unity of love, Stump says that you and your beloved, that you need to have mutual closeness. And this involves that you and your beloved are both aware of each other and you're both willing to reveal yourself to each other. So like there's this willingness to share your innermost thoughts, desires, and concerns with your beloved. But you need that, but that's not all, because you need more. Stump says that you and your beloved need to have, like, you know, some kind of understanding or comprehension of each other. And according to Stump, you need to have some degree of empathy and emotional intelligence in order to understand your beloved, in order to be close to them. So if me and my beloved don't actually accept each other, if we're not able to really understand each other, then we're not going to be that close. And so in order to satisfy this desire to be united with your beloved, you and your beloved, they need to satisfy, you know, all these different things for mutual closeness, this comprehension, this acceptance, this revelation of one another. That's all just kind of wrapped up in this unity desire. So there's two different things I do in the book. So first, what I do is I point out that I don't think it really makes any sense for a classical theist to speak in terms of God having desires. And so the entire idea of an impassible God having two desires of love, I think is just a non-starter. And this is because the God of classical theism is self-satisfied and so cannot have any desires. Further, desires, like, they're future-oriented. And so having a desire implies that one's desire is not yet satisfied. Because otherwise, why would you have a desire for something you've already got it, you know?
Yeah.
So a timeless and immutable God cannot have a future, and so cannot go from having a desire to having that desire satisfied. So the classical theism, like, I think it's just off to a really rough start in terms of its own understanding of love. So that's the first thing I kind of point out. The second thing I do, I just developed this argument that an impassible God cannot satisfy the desire to be united with us. So according to Stump, again, to go back to her account, in order to have mutual closeness, God needs to have the deepest possible understanding of who we are. And what she points out is that this requires empathy. But an impassible God, on her own understanding, cannot have empathy. And an impassible God cannot possibly understand what it is like to be in your state of suffering. And an impassible God is, he's in a state of pure, undisturbed happiness. And he cannot have an acquaintance with the overwhelming majority of human emotional experience. I mean, an impassible God cannot have any degree of suffering, anticipation that turns into delight, longing, disappointment, and so on. So basically, like, everything that makes us who we are as people, like everything that we deem important to reveal to those who we want to be close to. I mean, an impassible God has no understanding of any of that which makes us human. So an impassible God just cannot satisfy the basic requirements of mutual closeness for the unity of love. I mean, there's obviously a lot more detail to get into, and I do that in the book, but that's just the big idea, at least for this video. Right. So it's so we've got four premises, three premises and a conclusion. So it goes like this. So premise one, God has the emotion of wrath. Premise two, if God's wrath is caused or influenced by creatures, then God's wrath is dependent on creatures. Premise three, God's wrath is caused or influenced by creatures. And then you get this conclusion in premise four, which is thus God's wrath is dependent on creatures. So again, this conclusion is that God's wrath is dependent on creatures. And that contradicts the core claim of impassibility that God cannot be moved, influenced, or caused by anything outside of himself. And so in the book, I look at some different ways for the classical theist to try to avoid this argument. So for example, you might deny that God has the emotion of wrath. And it's like I said before, there are some classical theists who do this, but if you deny God's wrath, then you have to account for all the biblical data on God's wrath. And then you also have to explain how God is morally good. And so those are some big challenges. You might be able to meet those challenges. I'm not saying you can't, but it's a big challenge. Another option, though, is just to affirm that God has wrath, but then you could just deny that God's wrath is caused or influenced by creatures. So the classical theist, James Dozel, he says this, and I can't do Dozel's accent either, but he's American, so I feel like I should be able to. But here's what Dozel says. So Dozel says, like, our sins, be they ever so many, have no effect on God. So our sins, they just have no effect on God at all. And so I explore some different strategies here for the classical theist, but what I point out in the book is that each one seems to run up against this very weird problem. So you have to explain why God is angry. And because God's not angry at my sin, well, that seems really odd. So what else would be the object of God's wrath, if it's not my sin? I mean, maybe God's mad at himself. I don't know. That seems really weird. So, but I try to tease out the details of this on behalf of the classical theists, so that way people can, try to make up their own mind on these things.